I'm Winston Dabney. I was born in Virginia, near Richmond, Virginia, and I was inducted into the service in July 4th, 1941. I was one that was going in for 1 year and then get out. And it so happened I had about 6 months before the war actually started. And I received my basic training. I went in Fort Belvoir, Newton, North Carolina, because I was working down in North Carolina at the time. And I was assigned to the Corps of Engineers and transferred to Fort Belvoir, Virginia, which wasn't too far from my home. I I received my basic training at Fort Belvoir, and we were completing our basic training when they shipped out the entire brigade, so from Fort Belvoir, and they left me at the headquarters company sitting on my backpack. For some reason, I missed the orders to go overseas. Most of the fellows went over to the Philippines, which was unfortunate because I have heard from only a very few of them since that time. But anyway, shortly after they moved out, someone from the headquarters company, engineering training center in Fort Belvoir, came over and picked me up and took me over to the headquarters company, where they assigned me to personnel and classification section. So I was in the Fort Belvoir for maybe six months, or a little bit longer, and in the classification section primarily. And then after that, they needed cadre or certain military specialists to start a engineering training center down in Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. And so I was placed on orders to Camp Claiborne, and down there I was a staff sergeant, again working in classification section. My background and so forth was in business administration and accounting, and I think that was one reason that they selected me to move over to the headquarters company. There's always a lot of records and reports and so forth that you have to make out for military people. It's just a requirement that you have to have a morning report. You have to make the payroll and things in order to know what to keep up with all the military people. So this is partly what I was trained for and could take care of. In Camp Claiborne, we had a special setup down there with 2 officers, 2 typists, and one other enlisted man and myself. And we would go out and meet the trains, either one carload of soldiers, or it may have been 3 or 4 or 5 carloads of soldiers coming into Camp Claiborne. And so that we would go out to that area to meet that train out maybe 50, 75, or sometimes even 100 miles out, depending on the number of soldiers, enlisted personnel coming in to pick up the records and so forth, so that by the time they got into Camp Claiborne, we would have the rosters, the men assigned according to their specifications and so forth, and have the rosters all made out for them, so that when they got off the train in Camp Claiborne, we could assign them to the various units. It was special engineering companies, truck companies, pipeline companies, and this type of things that they were assigned to. and they would come in, and that's where they would get their basic training, and then they would ship out as a company to mostly overseas. After about 6 months or so of classification work, I then was made first sergeant of the headquarters company there at Camp Claiborne. Well, this consisted of, they had what they call cadre, or people that trained the soldiers that came in there in the different units and so forth. Out of headquarters company, they would train them. Therefore, I had something like 1,800 men that were considered cadre. And that means that they were probably sergeants, buck sergeants, tech sergeants, had at least had some rating. And so after that, after about 6 months, I was assigned to the headquarters company as the first sergeant, and from that point on, for a while, I was at first sergeant. And of course, the other thing that we had to do, every now and then we would get people in that were not able to go overseas and so forth. So these people would have to be screened, and then they were generally separated from their outfit and so forth and put into what we called a casualty company. So I also had those particular enlisted people too. And of course, with the first sergeant, there again, it was a matter of keeping a record, putting people on sick call, and making what is known as a morning report, which is really just a report of where the people are and what they are doing and so forth. Well,
can we hold for just a second? There's a
yeah.
Announcement there.
It's our, we're back.
You're back. Well, that lasted until the early part of 1944. And the latter part of 43 and the early part of 44 was when the Manhattan Project was beginning to get organized and so forth. And there were a number of stations that they needed certain specialists to do certain jobs. And so at Claiborne, they sent down a notice to the headquarters company that if you had a certain military specialist number, which is MOS, you could apply to be assigned to the Manhattan Project. Well, it was a number of us in the headquarters company, and that actually applied, and we were interviewed, checked for security and so forth, and finally received secret orders to be transported to Oak Ridge, Tennessee.
Excuse
At
me,
Oak.
if you could look at her a little bit more than you look at me.
Okay.
Yeah, that'd be better.
All right.
Thanks.
At Oak Ridge, we spent about 2 weeks being indoctrinated to the ways of the Manhattan Project, of what was required in this type of thing. And then from that point, we were shipped out to various Manhattan projects. Of course, if you knew where the projects were, they were in Washington State, Hanford, Washington, University of Chicago, University of California, Oak Ridge, and New York. And from Tennessee, that's where they shipped out the various people. It so happened that I was one that they shipped out to New Mexico, ended up in Lamy, and was brought up the hill by a whack driver, and it was one other fellow and myself that came up at that time, and there were a few enlisted people here that had already been inducted into the service, and they were here, but they had no control over them, so to speak. They were doing certain jobs in the tech area, what part of the tech area that had been completed. But other than that, no one was keeping track of them or sending in any reports of them to Oak Ridge, which did all the payroll and needed the morning reports and so forth for them. So that's where I started out in the Manhattan Project, was beginning, and I had no help in the what we call the orderly room, because they didn't send anyone with me at all to help me take care of getting out these reports and taking people to sick call or anything like that. And so I had the whole works. I had to be sure that I made the morning report. I had to order supplies and so forth. I didn't have a supply sergeant. I even had to take the laundry down to Bruns Hospital, which was in Santa Fe, and take it down one week, pick it up the next week. In other words, I had to do all these housekeeping chores, so to speak, to in order to get the military kind of on record and to know where they were and what they were doing and so forth. Shortly after that, I was made Master Sergeant. I came here as a first sergeant and was made Master Sergeant, which was a sergeant major then. And of course, we were continuously getting people transferred into Los Alamos. Most of them were coming from the Army Special Training Centers, which is ASTP. They were men that were in college, which had not been inducted into service at that particular time, but most of them were a little bit later, and they had skills in mathematics and engineering and physics and so forth that could help the scientists out to do some of the household chores and this type of thing, and of course some of them were far enough along to know, as to how to help them with certain engineering problems and physics problems and so forth. The company finally grew to something like 1,800 men. I thought I was coming into a unit that would be a normal company, which is something like 125 to 150 men. But no way, it was they just kept sending them in here as fast as they could to help with the various household chores. And of course they had a number of organizations here at the time. I guess the WACs were one of the first organizations that probably arrived. My present wife came in August of 1943. I didn't arrive until March of 1944. And so the WACs did a lot of the paperwork, so to speak. They acted as secretaries, and some of them were technically trained that could do electronics work and fill in a number of various jobs in the tech area themselves. A lot of them were drivers. I don't know, they had maybe 8, 10, 12 drivers that used to pick the scientists up in Albuquerque or Santa Fe, depending on how they arrived or where they arrived from, And they also had to go down a lot of times and pick up the enlisted men if it was just 2 or 3 or 4. Sometimes we had to send a bus down to pick up the enlisted men from Lamy and drive them up to Los Alamos. If so far as the military is concerned, we had very little recreation, and of course, most everybody was working at least 6 days a week. Some of them were even 7, and they were working anywhere from 10, 12 to 18 hours a day without even breaks. I even had some of my enlisted men that actually had cots out at the work area, and they would catch a few hours, maybe during the night or sometime while the experiment was running, and then continue on the next day, and so that we didn't really need a whole lot of recreation, but because most of it was spent during the working hours and so forth, that nobody had much time for anything else. We did have finally had a couple of theaters. One which maybe would have a movie maybe once or twice a week at night. It was used for other different recreational types. It was even used for a church on Sunday. Finally, after we got I think a priest came up maybe from Santa Fe or something after a while and was used as a church before the church here was ever built and so forth. The main recreation that we had on Sunday maybe, a group of us would get together and we could go to the mess hall and draw our rations of food and take it down to what is now the skating pond, if you've been down in that area, and we'd just have a little picnic. Maybe they were having fried chicken for Sunday, so we'd get so many pieces of fried chicken and maybe a little cheese and bread and what have you, and have a picnic and just kind of relax and lay around and talk and have a little fun on Sunday for a few hours. And of course that went on quite a while before they even had the priest to come up and have church services and so forth. And of course I guess there was no particular denomination. It was more or less a Catholic service or a united service, and everybody went that wanted to go to church. A few of the soldiers liked to hike, and they could hike a certain distance, but we had the MP detachment, which was the security for the whole area. And of course, at all the entrance were MPs, which you had to check in through whenever you went out of Los Alamos or when you came back in. You had a picture pass, which you used to get in and out of Los Alamos. They had MPs that on horseback patrolling the outside area, which was partly fenced and partly wasn't, but they made continuous patrols around the whole outside area of Los Alamos. So we were pretty well secured in that respect. And of course the location was very good so far as security was concerned too. And of course our mail was censored. If your letter said something that wasn't supposed to be said or sent out, the security would cut it out of the letter. And if you had too many cutouts, then he would send the letter back to you and tell you to rewrite it. I don't think I've ever had one of them send back to me, because it wasn't very much news you could give anybody anyway. I mean, you could tell them a little bit about the weather or maybe that the country was beautiful or something like that, and that's about all you could tell them, and that you were okay. And so that was kind of a restriction that was up here at that time.
Were you able to tell your family that you were in the country?
So far as the family knew, you were only at Post Office Box 1663, Santa Fe, New Mexico. That was all you could tell them. In fact, I had one daughter that was born in Post Office Box 1663, Santa Fe, but she was born up here. So it's just one of those things that we had to put up with.
Hang on,
Yeah,
just a second.
you want to hold it?
We got- Well, it's not too bad now. Let's see.
Yeah. You okay?
Okay, go ahead.
So how'd you meet your wife?
Pardon?
How'd you meet your wife?
How did I meet my wife? Well, we were both in service. She was in the wax, and we were both master sergeants. So, kind of the grades kind of matched together to a certain extent, and I don't know, a friend I think kind of introduced me to her because I didn't know her when I came up here, and kind of introduced us, and we started going together a little bit. I mean, at night maybe we could see each other a little bit, and maybe we'd go to a movie once in a while. And then we would get together and go on these picnics and this type of thing. So it was really through another friend actually introducing us. But we were both master sergeants, so we couldn't pull rank on each other. And we got along pretty well for quite a while. And I guess I was here maybe 6 months, a little bit longer before I actually met her. So. And she was working in the technical area. She had worked for Zenith Company as a electronic technician, and she happened to be in one of the groups that were doing a lot of electronic work. So she managed to get into the tech area to do electronics work, and then she was involved with some of the testing shots and so forth with the HE and various things that they were doing at that time. And a lot of times I would go several days before I would ever even see her, because she would leave out early in the morning, and then they would stay out late at night and wouldn't get in until midnight or something like that. If they had a shot going that they had to finish, or they'd get it to a certain point, and maybe they could leave it. But a lot of times she worked 18 hours and so forth in the tech area. And we finally near the end, shortly after the bomb dropped and so forth, we decided we'd get married in August. And really, when we decided this, we didn't know that the war was going to be over on the 14th. And really, we had originally planned for the 14th, but our friends and so forth in the service would not let us. That happened to be a Tuesday, and they would not let us get married on Tuesday. They said you got to wait till the weekend, so we had to move it out to the 18th. And we were married down in Santa Fe at the Catholic chapel, and we had a reception at the La Fonda. But before the war was over, we had arranged to furnish everything, even before it was actually declared over. And we had to take down practically everything that we needed down to Santa Fe and but they were kind enough to let the wax, it was, Jean had 5 or 6 or 7 close friend wax and so forth that went down with her, and they went down the night before, and they let the wax in the kitchen to do all the orders and so forth. And of course, I had to get the spirits to to have the bar open, which one of the officers was able to secure that for me, but we had to still take it down to Santa Fe. I had to borrow a car to go on a honeymoon. Her sister came out, so we had to drive her part of the way so that she could catch a train or something to get back home. And then we had my officer was kind enough to let me have 2 3-day passes, both of us 3-day passes, and we stayed up in Red River for 6 days, and then when we came back, of course, we couldn't get housing in Los Alamos. She had her dorm room and I had my dorm room because we were master sergeants. But we both had to stay in the dormitories until we could manage to get some kind of arrangements for where we could live together. And we did manage to get a dormitory room, which was about half the size of this room, and that's what we had. And actually, when we first walked in there, it was army cots, bunk beds, wooden bunk beds. So we had to shift things around to get those bunk beds set out side by side. And then we could do a little cooking and stuff with a hot plate or oven or something that we had. And so I guess we had that dorm room for something like 2 or 3 months at least. And what we'd do, some of the scientists would go on vacation or something for a couple of weeks, and they were kind enough to let us use their house. And at Christmas, one of the scientists went back to England, and he was gone for a month. So he let us use his place for a whole month. And that was the Christmas 1945, which we hadn't been married very long, but that Christmas was a time when the water pipe froze and we had no water in Los Alamos. They were running tankers up from the Rio Grande, and they were rationing water out. I mean, you could take a gallon jug over, or a bucket or something like that, but you would maybe allow a couple of gallons of water would be maximum that you could have. Well, that Christmas, we invited 25 of the enlisted personnel that stayed here that year. Couldn't get away for furlough and so forth. And we invited 25 of the enlisted personnel over for dinner. And of course, Jean had never cooked a turkey in her life before. She'd had turkey and stuff, but I mean, her mother always did it for her. But we got this, I think we got about a 20 or 25 pound turkey, and I'm not sure that we could even get the oven door closed. But anyway, we cooked that turkey, and she bought I don't know how many 10 or 12 loaves of bread for dressing and so forth. Well, you couldn't get that much dressing in a turkey. But anyway, it was fun, and we enjoyed it. And I guess we didn't have paper plates at that time because we used all the dishes that they had in the house. And of course, we had no water. The water wasn't coming through the pipes or anything, so we stacked the dishes into the bathtub. They happened to have a bathtub. I guess that particular house had a bathtub. And so we stacked the dishes in there, and we'd have to wash 2 or 3 or 4 dishes a day or something. But we finally got them all washed before they came back from vacation. But that was quite an experience, I'll tell you.
About a minute left on this tape.
Pardon?
One more minute on
What?
that tape,
On that tape.
yeah. So,
To regress a little bit, when I first came up here, I came up in March 31st, 44, and at that time, they didn't have military barracks completed. Housing was very short, and I was in one of the green hutments that we had 4 men in each hutment with a little cold stove, I think it was, in the middle of it. And the night we arrived, we got up the next morning, we had a foot of snow on the ground, April 1. So that was experience. And then, of course, this was up where the police station, and no, not where the police station is, where Merrimack Village is now. And we had to go from there down to almost down to where the hospital is, for the mess hall. Not too long after that, then they completed another barracks down in the area where the mess hall was. So I was able to move down to the barracks shortly after that. So I didn't stay up in that hutment for too long. And of course, at that time, there were no paved streets or anything like this. The one main drag down through town was what is now Trinity Drive, and it was a mud street. So in the summer, when the spring, when the thaw came, that they'd have to push the jeeps and the cars and so forth through part of the mud holes and what have you. And they finally built some slat walkways on one side of Trinity Drive so that people could walk up and down Trinity Drive. And it was very few automobiles up here at that particular time. So I mean, any place you want to go, you walk. I was pretty fortunate myself, being the sergeant major and so forth. I did have a government car assigned to me, because I had to go to Santa Fe to pick up enlisted personnel. I had to go down sometimes to pick up barracks bags, which didn't come in with the men for some reason or another, and things like this. And so that I was able to take down maybe a couple of enlisted personnel with me if I had to go down, say, late one evening or something, and we'd go down and maybe have dinner down in Santa Fe and then come back to the hill.
it sounds as if everybody is so energetic.
Well,
Talk to people, how to explain this high level of energy?
well, I think everyone was somewhat on a nerve edge, I guess, to a certain extent. I mean, because you had very little time to relax, and of course like I say, you were working anywhere from 10, 12, 18 hours a day. I mean, it was nothing for some of those scientists to work 48 hours without even stopping, because they'd get into the middle of an experiment or something, and they would not turn that thing loose until they had completed it. And if it took a week, they'd stay with it. And some way or another, I don't know how they really made it, but I guess they're built different from most of us.
Did you feel as a community that there's a lot of cohesiveness, despite the...
I think there was a lot of cohesion with the scientists and especially the military and so forth. We never had any difficulty with the scientists at all. And of course, we didn't have much opportunity to really be with them unless you were a fairly good friend. If you had worked for and with a scientist every day and so forth, and he liked you, you were at times you were invited out to his house for a meal. I was Jean and myself. She worked with the scientists. I didn't. I was in the audit room most of the time. So, but she'd made friends with some of and we had a couple of very good friends that we made friends with, and we did have meals with them and so forth. We one Christmas. Daryl Froman invited us with him to go down to Warner's, the little place down by Ottaway Bridge, which you've probably heard about. And we had Christmas dinner, and we had, I don't know, any number of scientists. She could only seat, I think it was something like about 12 or 15 people. But with Daryl Froman, and Al Graves was another one that worked with Daryl Froman a lot, and a number of the scientists were with them. But I remember that Jean and myself, he invited us to go down with him because she'd worked with him, and he used to call her his right-hand man, and so we got pretty close with him. To relate one story, coming back one time from Virginia after the war was over, we were driving back, and we'd come through Kansas, and it was so hot that we had a few raindrops, and they hit on the hood of the car, and I could never get those raindrops off the car. It burnt right into the paint. And there were other times when
Hang on just a second. I think we're threatening to have a, hey, we're back.
all right, we were driving back from Virginia after the war was over, and our daughter was 6 months old, and that particular trip we had gone to Niagara Falls. Well, Jean had a sister in Michigan. We went to Michigan and through the edge of Canada and came out at Niagara Falls, so we had to wake her up and show her the falls at night with the colors and so forth. And then we drove on through to Connecticut to visit one of the enlisted personnel that we were friends when we were here. And we couldn't find a place to stay that night. We had to drive all night, and finally the next morning I finally found a motel that we could get for the day. And so I slept a few hours, and then we went ahead and completed our trip. But coming back, when it was so hot, we burned out a generator coming through Kansas. I was lucky to find a person that was willing to replace it for me and so forth. But after we left Kansas, we couldn't find any gas station that was open. I just felt like we were going to run out of gas. And finally, this Daryl Froman lived down the valley just below here. And so we pulled into his place at night about 2 o'clock or something like that, and woke him up to get 5 gallons of gas so we could get back to the hill. But he didn't seem to mind too much. He always had gas. He was running I think he was running a generator for his electricity and so forth down there. He had a nice place down there. And but that's just one instance we had, and we made a number of trips back to Virginia. But I won't bore you with those, because those were hard trips back in those days. I'll tell you, the 2-lane roads and truckers and what have you, and the roads were not as good as they are now. But let me tell you a little bit about the housing when I first came up. I guess I don't know how this falls into sequence, but it doesn't too much. But anyway, I think you need to know when we first came up. See, they had very little housing that had actually been constructed, and they were moving in some prefabs and this type of thing, and then they were moving in what they call Quonset huts, which are the round metal type hut, and then they moved in the Hanford house, which is a little better house from some other military base or something. And then, of course, they were still building a few houses. But these houses were scattered around, and part of them are just below where the community area is now. And they weren't too bad, but a lot of the houses that they moved in were just kind of shacks, and all the houses were really temporary, and they were all camouflaged with primarily green trim and green boards on the outside and stuff, so that supposedly you couldn't recognize a town from flying over it and so forth. Of course, flying over it was restricted also. They couldn't. They weren't supposed to fly over it, but they did once in a while. We were always short, it seemed, on barracks. The WACs were in the big house for part of the time when they first came in, and that was pretty good because the boys' school had used that for sleeping quarters and so forth. But they used to sleep outside on the porch, summer and winter. So it wasn't the bedrooms weren't too numerous in it. It was I don't know just how many they had there, but anyway, the WACs had that for just a while, and then they finally built some barracks for the WACs. And of course, the special engineer detachment, we had they were building those not as fast as the men were coming in, but at least they were putting them up as fast as they could. And these were barracks that would accommodate normally about 30 men, and all of them had double deck beds, which meant that you were sleeping 60 men in a 30-man barracks. There was no permanent housing built at all except the bathtub row, and of course the top scientists had those houses. And even the housing that they built what they call sunt apartments down along Trinity Drive, and those were 1 and 2 bedrooms, but they'd have like maybe 6 or 8 units together, and they were up and down units. So they were not really the best type housing. I mean, well, they gave you a place to sleep, and that's about it.
Ellen, do you have to leave? Or you...
Yeah, I was wondering if I'm just to go take a real quick break and then I'll get out of
Put it in
Yeah,
order,
well,
we can get...
I hope you
Okay,
can. I hope you could get it in some kind of
Oh,
order.
yeah, no, you don't
But
have
I'm
to
jumping
worry about
around.
that,
I
because-
realize that.
No, it will be edited.
You're back and going.
Okay. Finally, they built a WAC dormitory, which was not too far. Well, it was kind of across the road from where we had the enlisted men's dormitory, and of course, Gene happened to be in that particular one. Getting back to our relationship, so I guess we could look out of our windows and see each other at night and so forth a little bit after bed check. We never had bed check in the enlisted men, but the women did. They had to be checked in every night, I guess. So that accounted for. We did have what we call a PX, which was like kind of like a store that we in the end of one of our buildings, what we call the orderly room, you could get candy bars, and I think we could even get beer. I'm not sure that they had beer. I know you could get soft drinks and so forth, but I don't believe it could get beer because it was kind of an army reservation, so that they wouldn't let you have. Supposedly didn't have liquor and beer and so forth. I'm sure there was plenty of it up here, but you didn't buy it over the counter. But you could get most anything you needed, shaving equipment and paper and various things from the PX that you needed, and it kept pretty well stocked. They also had a commissary for the civilians, but again they were limited to ration stamps like people outside and so forth. But we had no ration office up here, so they had to come from Santa Fe, and they used them, for meats and gas and tires and what have you. And but they were pretty hard to come by coming from Santa Fe and so forth. So far as enlisted personnel, we couldn't buy anything really in the commissary as long as we were in service and so forth. Any food and so forth we received, we got from the mess hall if you got anything like that. Excuse me. I don't know why I'm so dry. But I was pretty lucky, I guess, in that respect. That being a master sergeant, I could go to the mess hall and more or less order what kind of meal I wanted if you had it in stock. If they didn't have it there, I had to take what they were serving that particular day, and they did serve pretty good meals. We used to get. Like I say, for those picnics and so forth, we used to get pretty much what we needed or what we wanted, because they did have butter and sometimes we'd get steaks, but most of the time it would be prepared food. I mean, like a fried chicken or whatever they were serving that particular day, and that's what we generally had.
In terms of your knowledge of what the project was about, did that come gradually over time, or?
I had very little knowledge because I wasn't in the tech area and so forth. And overall, I would say that there were very few people that knew actually what was going on or what they would. I'm sure that they knew that we were trying to build a bomb, but they didn't know what kind or what the final results were going to be. Some of the fellows said they thought they knew what was going on, but I'm not so sure that they did. But there was very little conversation between people as to what you were doing in the tech area and so forth. I was never real curious, I guess, but the only information that I found out about was through Jean, my wife, which we would, talk a little bit about what was going on, and she might tell me what kind of experiments they were running and so forth, which was primarily HE type experiments and this type of thing, which was pretty dangerous, really. but we never really discussed it too much so far as what really was going on in the tech area.
And just for the audience, can you explain HE stands
Pardon?
for? Tell people what HE stands for.
Well, that's high explosives. And they made all kinds of special shapes and forms and so forth to try and get different results and to get them all to work together and so forth. So it was just a lot of exploding. The HE, you could hear the windows rattling and a few things dropping off the walls and so forth. But and that went on even after the war, as far as that's concerned. But during the war, you didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it. You knew that they were experimenting, and that was it.
So if you had known where you were going, would you have signed up?
If I'd have known where I was
Yeah, would you-
going at Los Alamos,
Yeah.
I didn't have much choice. Well, really, I guess, yeah, I could have refused. I mean, when I was at Camp Claiborne, and if you ever been down in that part of the country, it's not the best place to be, so far as I'm concerned. And we were living down there. We were living in tents. We had tents, and you had a mosquito netting that you slept in that was over your bed and so forth. And when you get up in the morning, you move that netting off so you could get out, and you'd get your shower. That's how wet it was. So I was kind of glad to get away from Louisiana, Camp Claiborne. And so I volunteered to a certain extent to. Well, I didn't really volunteer either. I mean, because they interviewed you. I mean, they really questioned you pretty much, and they wanted to know if you could kind of live in isolation for a period of time and so forth without having to go off to town or something like this. Well, that didn't bother me too much either, but that was one of the main things. They because when you first came here, they told you you're here and that's it. You're not leaving. And so after I got here, I realized what I was into, more or less. And of course, this wasn't when I first came. It wasn't very exciting even then, because the things were so. They were really just beginning to put things together and what have you. They were building the tech area. More or less, all of it was up close to where the Los Alamos Inn is now, and they had a warehouse area there. They had the administration buildings were alongside Trinity Drive. They had the chemistry building. They had the graphite shop. They had a regular machine shop and so forth. And they built it up close in this area because of the pond. They needed a pond in case of fire. And we did have a big fire in what we call a C shop, which was a machine shop. And that kind of slowed things up for a while too. But that's one reason that the area was the tech area was built up in this particular area at that time, except for the areas out and around the various test areas and certain things had to be done away from the town.
Did you have any interaction with the Hispanic or Pueblo populations, or how did that relationship between?
Well, not too much. we did more after the war. We were able to go down like to San Ildefonso and Santa Clara. We had a maid that was from Santa Clara. She worked for us for 20, 25 years, I guess. This was even after the war, and we got a house of our own, which was sometime about early 1946, I guess. Well, we did have one of the Sun apartments, which we lived in for a while, and then they built the western area, and I managed to get one of the western area homes, 2-bedroom. But well, I had a number of the fellows, Indians, in the special engineer detachment. One of them was very popular with he was at one time the governor of the San Ildefonso Pueblo, and we had a number of pieces of pottery and so forth that were made by Maria, but I think we've gotten rid of all of them for some unknown reason. And I guess we gave them to family members or something, as gifts and what have you. But that's the way it goes, You don't know what you're losing. But
Well, does anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, I think he's covered the waterfront.
You have done a
well,
great
pretty
job.
much, I tell you.
This is really terrific. You
Why don't you
Being
say
here
that
at Los
again?
Alamos.
Start that again.
Pardon?
Start that again.
Yeah. I think very, very few people would. A lot of people would give their eye teeth to have the experience that we had during the war years and so forth. Sometimes it was hard, but I mean, we had a good life. And then after we stayed here after the war, well, for a number of years we didn't think we'd really stay here forever, but we did. And right now we've been here since 44 to 203. It'll be 60 years next year, 59 years.